So we talked about westward expansion a few videos ago, and I briefly mentioned the Native Americans and how it was really hard for them because as colonists and Americans wanted to move west, the Native Americans that had been there, something had to give. They couldn't both live there. So by 1830, most of the tribes had been pushed west of the Mississippi River. So there were bits and pieces of about 100 tribes still left in the South, but any of those tribes that were left, they had a lot of suffering to come because as colonists moved west, colonists were not nice, they weren't friendly, and it wasn't even that they were welcoming because they shouldn't have been the ones to welcome them because it was the Native Americans were already there. But so the smaller pieces of the tribes that were there, they didn't last long, and it was a really hard life. There were 5 tribes, and they were called the 5 civilized tribes. And they all decided, they were like, I think that the way to avoid the white people coming in and taking over our land is to assimilate. We're going to act more like them. We'll change some of our ways, and we'll act like we're a white colony, and then we'll be like they are, and they won't want to take our land. And so they adopted a white way of life. They farmed, they built homes, they built schools, they had newspapers. They did what the colonists did. And those tribes were the Cherokee, the Creek Indians, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole Indians. So those Native American tribes, they were established. They were living life as the colonists did. It says in the lesson that they adopted the white way of life. So they didn't look like the colonists, but they acted like them. They conducted business like them. But it still wasn't enough because the colonists wanted their land and they didn't really care if they were acting like them. They cared that they were Native Americans and they wanted their land and they were going to take it. So at this time we have President Jackson. He's our president. So Andrew Jackson is president, and he called the Native Americans savages. He wanted to push them even further west. So he passed in 1830 the Indian Removal Act. And what it was it told Native Americans that they had to relocate to Indian Territory, which is where the state of Oklahoma is now. So they had to move west. So even though these 5 tribes had done what they thought would work to where they didn't have to be removed, President Jackson said, no, I'm moving it anyway. So then somebody from the Cherokee tribe went to the Supreme Court and they said, this isn't right. Can you help us? So the Supreme Court told President Jackson, you can't do that. Like, that's not in your presidential power. You can't do that. You can't make these people move. Well, he ignored it. And he sent, it's called the Trail of Tears, he sent the army to get the Cherokee tribe and in the middle of winter and escorted them to Indian Territory. So the Cherokees didn't have an option. The army showed up and they marched them through, they were in the South, marched them to Oklahoma. It was in the winter. These people didn't have warm shoes. They didn't have warm clothes. They were sleeping outside. They weren't sleeping in tents or shelters. So about 15,000 of them left. About 4,000 of them died on the way there because of the cold, or they were hungry, or they picked up diseases. So that's why it's called the Trail of Tears, because they were being moved. They were being forced out of their homes where they've always lived. And so many of them died because the conditions of moving them, they were so poor. And it was, it's the winter, it was cold. They didn't have a choice. They were being marched by the army. It was super, super sad.